So, Chapter 4 that we are now discussing is a pretty deeper analysis of the further development of the British Empire into the mid 1700s, and how the slave trade, specifically the Triangle Trade, the Middle Passage, how slavery really fueled this further development up to this point. The primary focus of the British Empire by 1700 was still the Caribbean, because sugar profits were the empire's biggest asset. So this is how they made the overwhelming majority of the raw good profits from the New World. In time, though, slave labor, especially after John Rolfe brings tobacco to Jamestown, and the Chesapeake region starts to make a lot of money in the tobacco industry, that becomes more profitable. So what is today the southern United States starts to develop further using slave labor. But even then, direct importation of African slaves to the British North American colonies was relatively limited. As slavery developed, though, so did racism, because as we mentioned before, you are going to want to justify your actions against other people. If you're abusive to other humans, you're going to need a way of feeling better about that. And in 1762, a Quaker abolitionist by the name of John Woolman is quoted as having said that the idea of slavery being connected with the black color and liberty with the white. So, as we've mentioned before, slavery is much more of an economic institution than anything else, but for people to justify their horrific actions, racism definitely develops as time goes on. You can see this map. I actually used it in the previous chapter lecture as well. And what I was saying before about, for the most part, relatively small numbers of African slaves making their way to the British North American colonies, and in our discussion also talking about how the largest number went directly to Brazil in the Portuguese Empire. This really should help you to wrap your brain around the scale of the slave trade. Just the sheer number, the sheer millions of Africans that are taken out of West Africa and sold into slavery. We know that a good number came to the British colonies, but on the scale, the good number that we know of, that large number, still only makes up 4% of the overall African slave trade, which leads you to wonder just how insanely large is the number that we mentioned here. Just how insanely large is that if we are talking about the overall impact of the African slave trade on West Africa? Wrap your brain around that. That we know lots and lots of slaves were brought to the British colonies, but in the grand scheme of things, that was one of the smallest numbers of slaves. So to think the sheer number that the Portuguese were chewing up and spitting out in Brazil on their sugar plantations, it just is mind-boggling to think of. We mentioned in class the Triangle Trade. Now, the Triangle Trade is a general flow of goods from the New World to Europe of raw goods. You'll see in your notes, however, that some specific things are listed. Then these raw goods are produced into finished goods, and from Europe they are taken to Africa as finished products, and those finished products are traded for more slaves, who are then taken back to the New World to keep the cycle going. Raw goods would then be produced by that slave labor to be taken back to Europe, to then produce into goods, to get more slaves, to produce more raw goods. The cycle remained constant. Now, what you will notice is that with all these many different red lines showing trade routes, there are some people. I used John Hancock in Boston as the example. He really only ever traveled between Europe and his home in Boston trading. Yet, due to the general flow of things in the triangle trade, he is, although not directly, linked to the slave trade, because the wealth that he is creating for himself also creates wealth for others, and that wealth is then used to trade for more slaves. So this complex map just shows you that there are many different trade routes, that maybe only one leg of the journey is your chosen career. John Hancock only did the raw goods to Britain and finished goods back to the New World leg of the journey. Others would only do the finished goods to Africa for more slaves leg of the journey, while maybe other colleagues of theirs that are doing nothing but bringing slaves to the New World and then bringing some of the raw goods back to Africa. Not everything is a singular flow in the one direction. That is just a good way, the triangle trade, of describing the general flow of things. But you can see that this map, that there are all kinds of goods going in all kinds of directions, and that it is the general flow of things that shapes the triangle. Now, in Central and South America, there is an insanely high death rate on the sugar plantations of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. Estimates are that 32% of all slaves that were taken to Brazil in the Portuguese Empire were that proportion of the overall pie. Excuse me if I just misspoke. That 32% of all slaves, and again I'll take you back to this map, is that 32% of all slaves taken out of West Africa were taken to Brazil alone. By 1700, only about 20,000 slaves had been imported to the British colonies of North America. Now, 20,000, we know, that's still a really large number. But when you do the math, okay, that 20,000 is only 4% of the slaves being brought out of West Africa, that gives you the kind of the numbers that are being taken to Brazil, because it's like 8 times that goes to Brazil. By 1770, another 70 years, however, the total slave population in the British colonies was 2.3 million. But historians estimate that only about 400,000 were ever brought directly from Africa. Here is the crazy thing for us in the modern world to wrap our brains around, is that the rest were bred in the British colonies. Yes, you read that correctly. Slaves were thought of and treated like livestock. And so when a man and a woman who were slaves had children, you would either expand your slave holdings, or if you so chose, sell those children at market for a profit. That's sickening. We find it sickening, but nonetheless, it is unfortunately the reality of things. It is often referred, later in history, we will cover this, as the second Middle Passage, when slaves that were once brought into the Chesapeake region of Virginia, what we now know as Virginia, and then sold again, or their offspring are sold into the deeper southern states like South Carolina or Georgia. This is another photo that I've already used in a previous presentation, but this is a larger, better view of a slave ship and the many decks of the slave ship. You can see here that there are multiple levels of this slave ship, all of which are tightly packed with slaves like you see above. And the death rates on these ships were rather high. If there was any disease, it spread rather quickly. And food rations were not given out enough. If you want to see the depiction of the Middle Passage that will forever give you an image of the horror of what this was like, I would encourage you to watch the Hollywood movie known as Amistad. It is disturbing, but I think in an odd way it's a good thing that it's disturbing, because it shows people just how horrific the past has been historically. And again, is a great example of, if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so we must learn things even that are horrific and uncomfortable, so that we could never ever allow something like that to happen again. So in the British American colonies, there are these concepts that Eric Foner, the writer of our textbook, likes us to grapple with, and that is Republicanism versus Liberalism. This concept of Republicanism is actually very different than the way we think of Republican today, because we hear the word Republican and we think of the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party. In fact, in this time, Republican would not have been a term used very much. If it was a term that was used very much, it would have been used manipulatively by the British government to claim that they did have Republican elements to their government by having Parliament, even though the king regularly circumvented Parliament. But the meaning of this is a government that is totally free of a monarchy, which obviously Britain could not claim to be a Republican government because there was a monarchy. The actual real meaning, totally free of a monarchy, would have been an extremely crazy, radical thing to say in the British colonies in the early 1700s. Now, the interesting thing is that even within this republicanism, the only people afforded the opportunity to have any representation or to be representatives at all were people who white and own land. This allowed the elites to keep control over society. This is very, very stark in contrast to the concept of liberalism. Again, this is a very different meaning than liberalism today. Liberalism today is generally associated with the political policies and beliefs of the Democratic Party in modern politics, but it's a very different meaning back then. Now, this term is made mainstream by Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, among others, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But these Enlightenment philosophers use this term liberal and liberalism to describe that all adult men, not just landowners, should be part of any fair and reasonable political system. And this is even more radical in this time period than this word republicanism. Republicanism was radical. Liberalism was like downright crazy. It was so radical. Here is a painting depiction of John Locke, probably one of the most well-known Enlightenment thinkers in the history of the world. Now, all of this thinking becomes a part of what becomes referred to as American governance. The right to be a member of a colonial assembly, such as the House of Burgesses in Virginia, was reserved for those who owned land. So republicanism is very much becoming a part of colonial governance. But voting rights are, of course, limited to white male landowners. So the leadership pool is very few. It's the elite only. Now, British colonists tend to feel quite autonomous, though, from the British Empire, even if they don't have representation of their own, due to the policy of salutary neglect. This might sound like oxymoronic, because salutary sounds like really nice, like salutations was an old school way of saying a very polite hello. In the children's book Charlotte's Web, one of the things that Charlotte teaches the pig, Wilbur the pig, one of the things she teaches him is to say salutations. So it's very nice. And then neglect, that's not a good word. It's a negative word. It means like, neglecting a child. That'd be awful. Well, in this historical term, salutary neglect means a neglect of the colonies that was actually a good thing for the colonies. One of the main reasons the American Revolution comes to be is when the British government tries to dictate more to the American colonies while not allowing them a representative in the parliament that was making the decisions. There will be much more to come on this as we see the American Revolution developing. Another thing is the concept of free speech within the colonial press. In this time period, it is pretty standard to think that only elite upper class people, maybe even the colonial governors, had the ability to speak freely, that average citizens really didn't. So common citizens could be thrown in jail or beheaded even for what would be referred to as blasphemous talk against the crown. So there's no real free press because of this lack of free speech, and authors and journalists could be thrown in jail for what was referred to as seditious libel, which is really no different than this term blasphemous, only that it was in the written word and not only spoken. In one super famous case, a printer by the name of John Peter Zenger was jailed for libel after criticizing the New York colonial governor, Sir William Cosby. And no, I am not referring to Bill Cosby, the comedian and former Jell-O spokesman. You guys are probably way too young for that. He was a very popular Jell-O spokesman when I was a kid and had his own The Cosby Show on television. No, that's not who I'm referring to. Zenger, after writing things about the colonial governor, Cosby, is thrown in jail, but he takes it to trial and he is acquitted after his attorney successfully argued that nothing Zenger had printed was false and therefore could not be considered libel. And libel is really just defamation of character. Because everything he had written was true, he could not be considered guilty of libel. So this really sets the stage for our First Amendment that is added to the Constitution via the Bill of Rights, and setting the stage for a strong belief in free speech and the free press. You can see fancy schmancy Sir William Cosby, the colonial governor of New York, on the left, and a depiction of John Peter Zenger, the printer, above the writing. So, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke that we mentioned before promoted concepts like the natural rights of man, individual liberties being very important, specifically when John Locke refers to life, liberty, and property. Using reason and logic to make significant societal or governmental decisions rather than traditions like religious beliefs. So reason and logic is not something that is used in monarchies to make decisions. And with people like John Locke promoting that and promoting these ideas like liberalism, they are considered extremely radical for the time. Needless to say, this challenges the traditions in society. Political leaders, religious leaders, not just in the colonies, all over the world are feeling threatened by this. Individual liberty would challenge the political establishment. Trending away from religious tradition would also challenge church leaders. So due to these challenged traditions, the Enlightenment was considered to be extremely radical, particularly by the people that are already in a position of power. And we talked quite a bit about this in our Foner discussion. The Great Awakening is very specifically religious. Much like the Enlightenment is a direct challenge to political power, the Great Awakening is a direct challenge to religious traditions. Often summarized as the religion of the heart, the movement started by the Great Awakening promoting an individual's relationship with God or Christ. As long as you led a good moral Christian life, Jesus still loved you. Further, you didn't have to attend a church or donate to that church to be considered a good Christian. If you lived in a sparsely populated frontier, but you led this good moral Christian life, Jesus would still love you and you would still go to heaven in your afterlife. This is a very, very serious challenge to the power of the more traditional religious leaders. Attacks against Great Awakening preachers like George Whitefield were based on a lack of theological training that they claimed would create general disorder in the church. We obviously know that, with the benefit of hindsight, to be false. Here is a painting depicting George Whitefield and his followers. Now, the 7 Years' War. All of the European powers are using slavery to grow their wealth and their influence in North America. But Britain and France are the two main powers competing for influence in North America. Something's got to give. Spain is not a real threat because they're focusing on their sugar plantation holdings in Central and South America. So the main focal point of the war was, in fact, who is going to gain control of the Ohio River Valley. Both Britain and France had claimed parts of the Ohio River Valley. Much of the fighting, though, is actually done right here in New York State, with famous battles all throughout the Adirondack State Park. So despite the fact that the outcome of the war and the land that was being fought over was in the Ohio River Valley, quite a bit of the actual fighting was taking place in the North Country here in New York State. One of the most famous New York State battles is that of Fort William Henry on the southern shore of Lake George, and that battle is well depicted in the book by James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans. And it has been well done in numerous film adaptations, the most recent of which was in 1992. I actually went to school with kids from the Onondaga Nation who served as extras in the film. Here's a map depicting the European empires in North America as of 1750. So you obviously have here in green the British American colonies. In red you have Spanish influence. And then in the lavender purple color you have French influence. However, there are some of these territories that you can see intermixed lines. So the frontier of New York down through western Pennsylvania, what is today western Pennsylvania, much of what is today North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina. These are areas that were disputed between Britain and France. And then what was claimed by France, but Britain surely wanted, was the Ohio River Valley and the Tennessee River Valley. So these are territories that the two sides are going to duke it out over. Now, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain beats France and immediately tries to clamp down on their North American colonies. I said I would refer to this again, and here we are. This policy of salutary neglect is now over. So instead of leaving the colonies to govern themselves, they're now trying to have more control. The levying of taxes is often what you learn about in elementary schools, the primary cause of the American Revolution. The famous saying, no taxation without representation. Actually, while that was an issue, absolutely, it was really only an issue for upper class people like John Hancock, who was a rich merchant. Lower class folks were most angry about this proclamation of 1763, in which the proclamation line used the natural boundary of the Appalachian Mountains to say no settlement beyond this line can take place. Now the British are simply trying to minimize conflicts with Native American tribes, but it enrages settlers who are lower class and want land, as well as land speculators, which included wealthy people like George Washington, who would purchase large swaths of land and then sell it off piece by piece at a profit. Now, they want to take advantage of the expulsion of the French from North America, both the lower classes that wanted the land and the upper classes that wanted to speculate in that land. You can see a depiction here of the proclamation line, and to point out a lot of the what was considered acceptable settlement areas of New York State was not much further north than Albany, and maybe a little bit into the Mohawk Valley. But really it is this Hudson and Mohawk Valley regions that are considered acceptable to settle in, and then out in the remainder of New York, what we now know as central or western New York, as well as northern New York, was going to be considered off limits. So that is a local example here in New York State. There were plenty of other conflicting stories of what back then was thought of as Western Virginia, as the Western Carolinas, as the Ohio River Valley. These areas were places outside of New York. New York is what we are most familiar with. These are places outside of New York where the conflict over the proclamation line was equally as tense. So on the eve of the Revolution, you have the taxes, the proclamation line, that have pretty much anybody from any walk of life angry with the British Crown. As far back as 1754, however, you had a plan issued by none other than Ben Franklin called the Albany Plan of Union. So this is just as the French and Indian War, better known as the 7 Years' War, because it was actually a global conflict, but what was specifically here in North America was known as the French and Indian War. They wanted to unite the colonies against the French, and this is kind of a sneak peek of the individual colonies preferring their own autonomy rather than cooperating. So not only does this kind of set the stage for the American Revolution, it also sets the stage for the heated debates that will eventually be had when writing the Constitution, because the autonomy piece, preferring autonomy than to cooperation, is going to absolutely be referred to again when we cover the writing of the Constitution and the debates had at the Constitutional Convention. So that concludes our Chapter 4 lecture. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and I will see you in class.